The existence of this being belongs only in lore and legend of the cold American wilderness of Nebraska, where a lone farmer and his family lived in relative solidarity. There was a nearby town of Broken Bone, where the farmer would take his livestock and produce to market, but his family lived rather private lives out on their farm near the woods. Their peace was broken one day when the farmer's aunt requested to stay on the farm. The farmer's wife deeply protested his aunt's presence and deplored her practice of the dark arts, but he obliged with his aunt's request. His aunt took her to stay in a spare home on the farm and mostly kept to herself, but the practice of dark arts by the aunt deeply disturbed the farmer's wife. The farmer ignored his wife's complaints and protests for many months on end. The wife told the children to stay away from their great aunt. "You stay away from your great aunt. She is evil, and I do not care what your father says about her. Do not bother your aunt in her home." Both of the children understood their mother's orders, but they did not carry the same fear for their great aunt as their mother did. As each day passed, relations between both the farmer's wife and his aunt grew more hostile. During the late hours on a fall evening, nearing the day of All Hallows Eve, there was a fight that broke out between the wife and the aunt. Both of them wanted to make a wonderful dinner, but the wife did not want the aunt cooking in the kitchen. "Leave my kitchen, you wretched, vile excuse of a woman." The wife took pride in her kitchen, and witnessing the one person she despised more than anyone or anything else in the world impeding in her work drove her to a boiling fury. "How can you not trust my skills in a kitchen? You are quite aware of the reason why I will not allow you into my kitchen, Beth. You are a vile witch, and I will not allow you to cook a poisonous brew for my family. But I merely wanted to provide a loving meal for my nephew and your children." The wife made her way up to the aunt, directly standing over her. "Do not speak a word of my children ever again." She held up a knife that she had been using before to slice potatoes with, and still held it firmly in her hand as she raised it to point directly at Beth. As the farmer made his way back to the house, after having finished gathering the most of what he could of the wheat and corn he was harvesting, he heard his wife and aunt arguing. Both of them were at their breaking points. The farmer made his way into his home with an angered motive, wanting to confront and settle the dispute once and for all. "Stop your quarreling. This is quite enough. Aunt Beth, you must leave." But before the farmer's wife had taken into account the knife in her hands, she swung the knife as she turned to face her husband and slashed clear through the aunt's left eye, completely severing the eye in two, as well as the final thread that welcomed her stay. The farmer's wife dropped the blade in horror and shock of what had just occurred, as the aunt cried out in pain. All the while the farmer's two children watched in horror as their great aunt dropped large crimson drops of blood onto the wooden floor of the house. The aunt moved away in shock and anger, and declared her final decision out loud. "I have had enough of your mistreatment, Hannah. I will leave your property tonight and never return. But know this, your transgressions will not go unnoticed, and the vengeful spirits of those who once walked the lands will show you no mercy." The aunt made her way past the children and wife to the front door, but as she made her exit, she told the farmer one thing he would never forget. "The seeds you sow yield more than just crop. They hold all that you love and despise. You will learn how to watch your yield one day, and will know exactly when to harvest it." The aunt gathered her most precious belongings and made her way out into the fields to leave the farm, but not without first stopping off by each of the scarecrows to deposit drops of a potion in the hay. After doing so, the aunt left the farmer's house to find a home somewhere else. The days went on after the incident, with the family having returned to normal during the daylight. But as night came, the farmer began to notice some strange movements in the fields. He noticed them nights on end, roaming the fields, watching, waiting, and anticipating his every move. The night of All Hallows Eve had arrived, and the farmer spent the day taking his crop to market and selling it. But as nightfall came, he searched through the fields before entering his home. He looked through the fields but found nothing but dead grass, corn stalks, and scarecrows. He grew worried, however, as he came across one scarecrow covered in blood marks, and found that one of the scarecrows was missing from its post. He ran towards his home, worried for the safety of his family, and his worry grew into sheer terror as he saw his front door ajar, allowing in the haunting glow of the All Hallows Eve moonlight. He darted into his home and came across a horrifying sight. Both of his children were laid out on the floor, bodies slashed and mutilated, their organs having been minced into tiny pieces, and their cold blood stained the wood floor of the farmer's home. Seated across from them was the farmer's now deceased wife, tied to a chair with both of her eyes having had their eyelids removed, so she couldn't look away from the gruesome death of her children. Her gaze was a petrified and lifeless gaze, one that invoked mortal terror and grievance in anyone who dared to look at her deceased face. Her neck had been slashed open, and her head laid limp, as her final breath was taken by the same monster who murdered her children. The farmer fell to his knees as he wept over the gruesome mess that was once his two beautiful children. He tried to grasp at their faces, but they quickly began to crumble into dust. His tears made marks in the vile pool of blood and flesh that was his children, and began to cause both of them to crumble to dust before his very eyes. He reached for his wife, but recoiled in fear as he witnessed her crumble to dust in the very chair she was placed in. The farmer's aunt appeared in the doorway to his home and spoke with a voice so wicked that the farmer's blood turned as cold as ice. "You see, nephew, every seed you sow will produce something if you let it grow long enough. Some things are grown to provide, but some are grown to take. You cast me out after all of the mistreatment and torture that I suffered at the hands of your wife. You deserve nothing but what you sowed, my nephew. You shall live forever with the weight of your mistakes, and you shall harvest the crop you shall seek out for eternity." And with that, the farmer's aunt turned around and walked away towards the field, unleashing her screeching and horrific laughter as she walked away from her hideous crime. As the farmer scrambled and tried to chase after his aunt, the missing scarecrow leaped from the shadows and pinned the farmer to the wooden floor. The scarecrow withdrew a large, blood-crusted knife from a sleeve it kept around its waist and began to plunge the large blade into the farmer's chest, stabbing again and again at the farmer's weak flesh and bone. The scarecrow made a hole that completely exposed the farmer's still-beating heart. The farmer watched helplessly in pain and pure horror as the scarecrow cut and removed the farmer's heart from his dying body and placed it within the straw of the scarecrow. For what the farmer believed were his final breaths, he took them in with the weight and remorse for his family, the one thing in the world that mattered to him above all else, and the one thing he could not replace. The farmer awoke again out in the fields, hoisted up on a post. However, he grew panicked when he saw that his hands were now made of straw, and that he now wore overalls, and that he had been placed upon a large wooden post in a field as a scarecrow. His new appearance left him in a delirious state of bewilderment and fear, as he now resembled the scarecrow that murdered everything he held dear. This cannot be. No, I have not changed. I am still alive. I must be. I cannot be dead. No, I am not dead. The overwhelming confusion and torment that the farmer experienced were further amplified as the realization of his new form and the loss of everything he once held dear sank in. I have not changed. This is all but a dream. None of this is real. If I just walk back to the house, everyone will be there. The farmer left his post and began to run towards the house through the fields and made his way back to the farm. Every corner of the fields looked neglected and abandoned, as if no one had maintained them for many years. His appearance only fueled his sorrow and rage as he tried to find his way back to the old farmhouse, hoping that by some slim chance his family was still there. However, the sight he witnessed was nothing he could have ever expected. No, the house cannot be abandoned. None of this is real. The farmer ran up to the front of the house, desperately trying to remove the boards that guarded the front door, and ripping off a sign that read, "Foreclosed." After fruitlessly attempting to open the door, the farmer peered into one of the dust-stained windows, only to see his old home in disarray. All of the farmer's personal belongings were gone, leaving the house as a rotting shell, to never be opened again. The farmer tried as he could to get inside, but failed after every attempt. He even removed the dagger from his new pocket that was used to murder his entire family, and began to try to break the glass, hoping that there was some possibility of returning inside. But it was no use. Nightfall arrived before his attempts had ceased, and with it too came the loss of overall despair and regret. These were replaced by a surging fury and lust for revenge. I will find Beth and make her pay for this. I have lost everything to her selfish schemes, and I will lay destruction in the way of anyone who dares to rob me of my revenge, or my home. The sadness and anger he felt that night carried on into his afterlife, as his soul was now forever bonded with the scarecrow that murdered his entire family. Legends tell of the farmer still living inside of the scarecrow, and remaining motionless by day, but roaming freely at night, searching for his family, as well as any unexpected guests to his fields. The town of Broken Bone has referred to him as Mr. Scarecrow, and warned anyone who dared to enter the field at night, lest they face the farmer who lost everything he once held dear, and become another product of his harvest. Mr. Scarecrow is a patient killer, who will lie in wait for his next seed to be sown, and for his next harvest to be collected by use of the same knife that took everything from him. Dare to face Mr. Scarecrow, and you will understand what was taken from him in your final moments, as he shows you what it truly means to lose everything you hold dear.